So what I'm going to talk about is going to be very different. I introduced a peer mentoring scheme in a boys-only boarding school, secondary school, and I just introduced it for the sixth formers, the lower six, and it was really the aim was to bring about the unhealthy culture in the school, and I'm really pleased I had the opportunity to do this. I've seen the individual pupils absolutely grow in their own confidence and personal strength. And I also saw how it was possible actually to change, or start to change, the behaviours and the attitudes of the boys. I don't know about the masters. I'm going to have to whiz through because I've got a limited time. I've got lots to say about the experience because I did 3 different things within the school and I could go off at different tangents, there's lots to say, but I'm going to really try and focus just on the peer mentor training and really perhaps start by saying how did it come about. So back in 1997, a pastorally minded housemaster asked me to develop and introduce a peer mentor training scheme in his house. So I already had a role of delivering the PSHE in his house, so I sort of knew a bit about the culture. That was an interesting experience, but that's another story. And then I was also running discussion groups for the sixth formers at, guess what, 9 o'clock at night. Wonderful. Anyway, so I'd not really got a clue what I was going to do, but I had to rummage around and I put something together. And I had to adapt it for a boarding environment. Most of the peer mentor schemes, Relate had one, various people had them, but they were not adapted for the boarding. So I started in one house. Word of mouth got round the other housemasters, and it led me to delivering it annually in 8 or 9 of the houses. First, I had to address the laddish culture. So when I started, some of the older boys were still feeling, won't surprise you, very aggrieved about how they were treated, and they just couldn't wait to take it out on the new boys, who were 13. There were all sorts of initiation things. So in some houses, the older boys ruled the roost. Other houses, actually the housemasters were in charge. So their thinking was really hard to shift, and we had lots of debates about it. They seemed to think, or my impression was, they seemed to think it was their right, it was only fair, it was a tradition, and so on. So I encouraged them to put their wish for revenge to one side and to think how they would have liked to have been treated themselves as new boys, and what would have been helpful in their first year, and then we could build that into the programme. I felt I had to meet them where they were at, which really meant giving them a bit of listening time, as you've said, and it's been said today. These boys aren't listened to, or boarders aren't listened to. So I gave them what I call spill before skill. So I needed to give them the time in order to get them on board. The second thing I did was to create what I hoped was a safe space. We were dealing with helping vulnerable younger boys. So I felt it was essential for me to provide a safe space for them to talk and to share. So I did this by asking the boys to put themselves forward. So basically asking for volunteers. Not all housemasters agreed with me, but I tried to do that. And so then the boys that came forward were keen to learn what I might call the softer skills. And they could feel more comfortable without the presence of those that I'm going to call the main men, who were not in the slightest bit interested in looking after younger boys. And I suppose it had helped that I'd done the PSHE, because I had observed the impact and the effect on a group of what I'm going to call the main men's attitudes and behaviours. Because a lot of younger boys had lots to contribute, didn't contribute. They stayed silent, inhibited, and I had to sometimes have a group of the main men, but generally I tried not to. Those that signed up were often the quieter boys, as I say, with lots to share. A third thing was really the size of the group. I wasn't in charge of that, but I found 6 to 8 in a group worked really well. So some houses we did 2 groups, I split them, did them back to back, went home and had a glass of wine. Safety levels built up, and you have to remember these boys are really wary of each other. They're the sixth formers, they're still wary of each other in some of the houses. And I needed them to feel comfortable doing role playing. We're going to do a lot of learning that way. I was pleased to notice that some of the sessions, became spaces where these boys actually could talk about their own experiences of tough stuff at the hands of other boys. And they knew what it was like to flounder in what I'm going to term a hostile environment. And they'd not felt free to talk about it before. So this was a space I always allowed time. This was a space for them to be heard. Some of them have got family issues going on in the background, which they didn't talk about, but they could in these groups. It's a sort of case of who would have listened to them. So that's one of the things I offered. Why was it successful creating a culture change, and why did it work so quickly? Well, I trained up the receptive pupils. That was a start. I encouraged them to start keeping an eye open for the younger boys so they could stem inappropriate behaviours or check on those that were unhappy. Helping those that felt homesick. It was interesting, that was mentioned today as a sort of bereavement and grieving. Or those that were being excluded or picked on. I'm sure all of these things are very familiar to you. Almost immediately, these older boys actually became proactive, and they began to learn how to be helpful, and they felt empowered, they're keen, they seemed delighted to start taking on an important role in the house. And this in turn led to a subtle change to any previous power or bullying culture. An unexpected benefit that I observed was the confidence of some of the individuals grew absolutely massively. I mean, this is the bit I loved. They blossomed. It's a funny word to use for a man, perhaps, but they blossomed. It was as if another side of their character was given freedom to emerge. They got a chance to shine, to grow. They could be seen for their qualities. I sensed they felt proud, and they were pleased to have an unusual role in the house. It was a new role. I suppose I'm talking about the boys who don't normally get noticed in a group. They're often the thoughtful, quieter, reflective boys, easily overtaken by the more vocal, quote, popular boys. I would like to think that the housemasters valued this added personal gain, but actually I think, if I'm honest, the housemasters wanted this scheme in their house, and it's great, and they benefited culture-wise. But I'm not sure they really took on board that individuals were gaining and were going to grow massively. The impact began to be felt, I suppose, each year when I trained up the next year, and then the next year and the next year. Within a house, you actually got the older boys being nicer to the younger boys, and you got a different feel in the house. I mean, I didn't live in the house, I was an outsider going in just for these sessions. But it just took a little bit of time to get, if you like, embedded. But it was only a year or two, as you had more years treating people better. And the housemasters started using these trained-up boys to deal with issues with the younger boys. I mean, that's good. They were really, taking it on board. You might want to know what I included in the sessions. So I suppose I offered them life skills. For use in the school, obviously, but in my head I was also offering them something they could use in their life afterwards, in their careers, in their relationships, in their whatever they were doing, university particularly. It was very experiential. I introduced, I suppose, active listening and what I might call EI or EQ skills. We used lots of role plays, and I hadn't realised they were all born actors. They absolutely loved it. We had discussions around many issues. So gave them a chance to air their views and give them a broader awareness on lots of different angles. I included as many possible scenarios as I could so that I'd get them really as prepared as possible. And we looked at how they could help the younger boys sort of survive and hopefully thrive as well. I'm following my notes, otherwise I shall go off at lots of tangents and you'll be here for another hour. To start with, I did notice that the boys were actually quite awkward trying out these new ways, but they began to feel safe in the group. Most instinctively wanted to rush to solve, to advise, to say, I know how you're feeling, and they found it so hard to listen and to be silent and let a younger boy say what was happening for him. But by the time they completed the training, they were much more able to do it, and actually some were complete naturals. So I was allocated the grand total of 4.5 hours, kept getting reduced down. It was always in the evenings, not ideal. And through role play, I think I used role play quite a lot. We looked at how to help the younger boys with some of these issues. So I'd get A and B to play, and sometimes an observer. We looked a lot at homesickness, boy worried about home issues, not settling into boarding, not settling into the UK culture. There were lots of overseas boys. Or even boys being disorganised and not coping in their early weeks. Boys being excluded, not being able to handle teasing. And I also got asked the boys to actually establish which of the new boys were unable to go home in the exeats and half terms, and for them to be, so they often went to a guardian. And I discovered a lot of boys didn't know the guardian they were going to, they'd never met them, which horrified me a little bit. But I got them to find out who they were and just to go and check, are you okay, was it all right, how did you get on? Because not all the guardians, some of the guardians, anyway, we won't go into that. In the main, I think the guardian system worked, but a lot of the other boys had no idea. I mean, when I said, well, what would you do? They said, well, why don't these boys go to a hotel if they don't like their guardian? Why don't these boys stay at the school? All sorts of ideas. Why don't they ask their friends if they can go? Well, I mean, if you count up the half terms and the exeats over the 5-year spell, it's a lot of big different people you've got to go and say, can I come and stay with you? It's not going to happen, is it? So I just wanted them to become aware, really, of someone else's life experience. I ran a whole session on bullying. I did always preface it with the fact that you're fed up with hearing about bullying in the PSHE sessions, but, they would go, oh, not bullying. But I said, we're coming at this from another angle. We're coming at this, you as the older boy, helping others. Lots of lively discussions. We looked at who would bully, why someone would bully, why someone might be the recipient of this behaviour, and their role as a senior pupil, being able to intervene. And I got their ideas on what strategies they'd use. I mean, they actually became quite useful sessions. I pointed out that as senior boys, I don't think they really got this, but as senior boys, older boys, they actually would be able to stem or challenge behaviours of even the year below them. So, remember these are the quieter, not in your face boys who needed to get the confidence to realise that they could go and do something useful. I wanted to give them an awareness that their normal is not someone else's normal. So if they were being, teased, they might deal with it in a particular way, but other boys will have a different resilience level, have a different ability to cope, may not be able to cope. So, for example, a fourth boy of 4 boys in a family will be very familiar, I think, with the rough and tumble of life, and will have different behaviour and thinking to, say, an only child, who will have been treated probably very differently. And in some houses, I have to say, there was still bullying among the year group. I always checked. They never answered, but you could see by their body language if it was going on or not. Usually, it had stopped by then, they got more mature. But it did give me excellent material to explore then and there if it was going on. So I tried to keep the awareness of these different things going. I'm just going to flag up there were 2 particular successful and unexpected outcomes of the bullying session. One of the bullies actually apologised to one of his year group in front of 20 of his peers for his unkind behaviour over the previous 4 years. I thought that was quite good. And another boy chose to challenge his year group within the safety of my facilitation. He had alerted me in advance, and he'd been suffering 4 years of being got at and unpleasantly teased because he was gay. Again, really brave, because the room was full of those boys who treated him badly and bullied him. And this was these 2 experiences where the whole house had been sent frog marched to the session, not my choice. But I thought that was very courageous that they were doing it, so I think it says something about what had been going on, that they then were enabled to apologise or to challenge. So once these boys were feeling a bit more comfortable, we'd done lots of role plays about the things I was mentioning earlier, we moved on to some more sensitive issues. Well, I think they're more sensitive, although all of them are, for use both in and out of school. So we looked at loss and bereavement, what to say and what not to say. Most adults don't know, so it was good for the boys to learn it early. Family issues, could be divorces, could be family illnesses. The other boys all knew something was going on in the family, but no one knew how to speak to a boy in their own year group let alone helping anyone else. Suicidal thoughts, usually they're external friends, sometimes their peers, rarely the younger boys, but these are all life skills. These are really useful and would be really useful at university, I thought. Confusion over sexuality. So I don't need to really tell you, but I'm sure you're all aware that traditionally ex-boarders, boys as well, learn to just manage their feelings instead of speaking about them, sharing them or seeking help. So I feel that this training really enabled another thinking to happen. I found time to also talk about racism, theft. We had quite an amusing role play of how to help if your friend got his girlfriend pregnant. Oh my goodness, they found it so hard not to say what they would have done in these circumstances and give loads of advice. You can probably guess what it was. But it was an excellent opportunity for them to really be encouraged to listen and to test out these new skills. We talked about disordered eating, sisters, girlfriends, occasionally peers. We looked at drug use, and I also, since today's been talking about abuse, we also, I alerted them as to how to handle it if a younger boy came, or one of their own peers, came and talked about abuse or abusive experience. So this could be at home, or it could be within the school, and what would they do and how would they handle it, and what really were they obliged to do to pass it on, and how would they do with that. I'm just going to add a bit here. We were talking earlier about making these schools safer for children. In the PSHE and the discussion groups, which I facilitated, the facilitators were in the main external to the school. And they were usually women, and they were usually older. Not as old as me, but they were older. And I think that's essential, because it freed the boys up to have all sorts of questions and discussions, which I don't think they would do with the staff. Sadly, that's changed, but we were all external, and they've changed the system now. Obviously, I covered where they'd go for help within the school, and also I supplied them with a list of external websites and resources to pass on. Another thing I thought important to introduce was thinking about why some of the pupils, particularly from the Eastern cultures, and there were a lot in the school, spent much of their time working really hard in their rooms. Well, who knows what they were doing, but I think they were working hard. They were in their rooms, but they were mocked for this and given all sorts of names. I knew that these boys felt under enormous pressure to what I'm going to call honour their family's expectation. They had to meet the grades, they had to get into the top universities, the family's view of the top universities. There were others from Western cultures who may have had their own achievement pressures, but not in the same way, not to honour the family. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but there is something quite different. So much so that I actually arranged for the senior management team, matrons and pastoral team, to have a speaker, a renowned speaker on East-West cultural differences. Because I have to say they didn't seem to be aware enough anyway. I encouraged the older boys to think about how these boys from other cultures could be welcomed and included and understood for why they were in their rooms. They were usually isolated, they were left out of informal activities within the house, they were unfamiliar with the joking and the rough and tumble and what they saw as disrespectful behaviour of the other boys, and they didn't know how to join in. And I just wanted a greater awareness so that something different could be happening. So sometimes the whole year, as I mentioned earlier, was instructed to attend. This I found very difficult to deal with because they didn't really want to be there. So one house, the boys just used it. They all came along and they used it to offload all their frustrations. They had a housemaster they thought was far too strict for their liking, and they weren't interested in developing these peer mental skills. I mean, a handful were, but the majority were not, and they just wanted to have a moan. So I reckoned that I would use the group slightly differently. I did offer the skills out, but I also spent a lot more time listening to their gripes. And those in the room that did want to learn what was happening didn't want the noisy ones, the main men, to actually realise that they were keen. So it was a difficult balance. And another house, interestingly, it was the senior boys who requested. The housemaster hadn't wanted the training, but the senior boys requested it, and this was very unusual. And they needed to know how to help the younger boys in their house. And actually, when I heard what they were dealing with, I could see why they'd requested the training. And just a little bit of feedback, I'm nearly finished, but a little bit of feedback from some of the boys that were trained up. Just wanted to share these. They tell me, they felt inspired, motivated to help, now had more courage, were wiser, more mature. They were more confident in knowing what to do. They felt very awkward how to help, but now they felt they could be of use. And that they valued this training much more than some of their discussion groups that they were compulsory, the 9 o'clock ones, for example, in the evening. So, from my point of view, it's really gratifying to know that the programme I created has proved to be what I think is a great success. It's changed behaviours and attitudes, and therefore the culture. It's empowering at least a half to 3/4 of each year group to understand behaviours and to have the knowledge and confidence to help younger boys handle their feelings and to blossom themselves. I mean, for me that's the exciting bit. I just really want to end by saying, wouldn't it have been wonderful if something along these lines had been available in my or your time as a boarder? Thank you for listening.